Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. My name is Mehran Kamrava. I am joined today by three of the most distinguished and perceptive experts I know on Iran and GCC affairs to discuss this important relationship between Iran and its neighbors to the south. It just so happens that today President Raisi of Iran is visiting Doha. And I'm also told that the Qatari foreign minister is in Tehran simultaneously, highlighting the importance of this critical relationship between Iran and the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, not just with Qatar, but with a whole host, but with all six of the states. So our three experts today will discuss a whole variety of topics for us, and allow me to introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking. First, Dina Esfandiary, who is a senior advisor in the Middle East and North Africa Department of the International Crisis Group. Dina's writings have been published widely, including in Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Washington Post, International Affairs, and I can go on and will be here all afternoon. I just want to highlight two of her books. One is called Triple Axis, Iran's Relations with Russia and China, which was published in 2018, and the other, Living on the Edge, Iran and the Practice of Nuclear Hedging, published in 2016. After Dina, another good friend of mine, Ibrahim Fraihat, will speak. Ibrahim is Dean of Student Affairs and Associate Professor in International Conflict Resolution here at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He's the recipient of the George Mason University's Distinguished Alumni Award for Achievement in the Field of Conflict Resolution. His latest publications include Iran and Saudi Arabia, Taming a Chaotic Conflict. It's a brilliant book. I know because I reviewed it for a journal. And of course, Unfinished Revolutions, Yemen, Libya, and Tunisia after the Arab Spring. And he has another brilliant book coming out in the near future with Syracuse University Press. Again, Ibrahim has a whole number of other publications. Last, but by no means least, another good friend of mine, Houchang Hassan-Yari, who joins us from Muscat, Oman today. Houchang is professor and head of the Political Science Department at Sultan Qaboos University in Oman. He is also professor emeritus at the Royal Military College of Canada. He has published numerous books and book chapters and articles in a number of academic journals, and I count myself honored and fortunate to be one of his co-authors in an article that we jointly published on the political system in Iran. A couple of his publications include The Middle East Peace Process, published in 2001, and Canada and the Arab-Israeli Conflict since 1947, as well as Regionalism and International Security. Thank you, Dina, Ibrahim, and Houchang for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you. And as I mentioned, this discussion is very timely, and I'm very much looking forward to listening and learning from all three of you. So Dina, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be amongst you. So I've been tasked with giving a quick overview of Iran's relations with the GCC states, and perhaps covering some of the states that the other speakers won't talk about so much. And all of that in just 10 minutes. So wish me luck. Basically, I'll start out with, this is a region that's been through a lot. and has undergone a lot of turmoil in the past, but also more recently, I would argue, particularly under President Trump, so Biden's predecessor. The US policy of maximum pressure led to a period of instability, unease, of Iran lashing out in the region and further worsening the security situation. And this was happening just as the Gulf Arab states believed the US was leaving the region. So there was greater pressure on them to basically secure themselves without the help of the US. And then add to that the pandemic and the whole slew of problems that it led to, including economic troubles in the region, but also just generally border issues and a range of other issues. And you find yourself with a region that to put it mildly, is very uncomfortable. But then since then, things seem to have somewhat improved. We seem to have headed towards a new era of pragmatism. There seems to be a push for dialogue and engagement within the GCC, but more importantly, arguably, with other states as well, countries outside the GCC, including Iran. So why this sudden pragmatism? I think there's several reasons for it. One is the effect of maximum pressure. I think that firstly, it was terrifying to see how much Iran was lashing out in the region. It really wasn't pulling any punches. And it was terrifying to see that happen at a time where the US was there to stir the trouble, but wasn't necessarily there to help clean it up afterwards. And we saw that with some of the strikes on the Saudi oil installations and the frankly muted response of the US to that strike. I think that again, COVID, aside from leading to economic troubles and public health issues, also highlighted that the virus doesn't really know any borders. It's not going to stop at Iran's borders. And if a big neighbor is affected, then all likelihood is that everybody else around them will also be affected. So this kind of highlighted that it actually made sense to engage and to help neighbors out, even if they were in competition with them. And I think also that there was a growing realization within the GCC that the divisions amongst themselves was making them weaker. Now, there has been an effort to mend some of these divisions. I think that's laudable, but I also think that for now, they haven't gone far enough to really mend some of the deep differences and the deep suspicions that lay among some states, again, within the GCC, but also with Iran. Dialogue so far in the region has been very limited and very much focused on de-escalation, in particular when Iran is concerned. So I want to look a little bit more specifically at some of these different relationships and dialogue tracks, and I'll leave out the Saudi one because I know my friend Ibrahim will cover it. So in terms of Iran's relations with the UAE, let's start with that. Their relations have thawed somewhat. The discussion started in a very limited manner, focusing just on maritime issues and on de-escalation. And the need for dialogue was highlighted, particularly after some Iranian officials directly threatened Dubai as a result of President Trump's maximum pressure campaign. And those were threats that were taken quite seriously in the UAE. So the Emiratis had to take matters into their own hands, and they adopted what I would call a two-pronged approach when it comes to Iran. They maintained their efforts to contain Iran, but that was done more in coordination with other countries. So with Saudi Arabia, in particular with the US, they continued to lobby for example, a US effort to contain Iran, but they decided that it was worthwhile engaging it as well. And actually, I think that's the right policy. So we had a bunch of back and forths between the two countries. Sheikh Tahnoun went to Iran. That was an unusually public visit for him. It was also very welcome. It was somewhat of a sign that this kind of thawing might potentially go beyond the administrations that you see in place in Iran. I think there is a mistrust on the part of the Gulf Arab states of the presidential system in Iran. And the idea is if we're going to establish ties with the Iranian system, we want to make sure that we're doing it with the people that are going to stay in place beyond the presidents in Iran. And I think you see that as well with the Saudi talks as well. The problem is that in the last month or so, the Houthis have begun to lash out in the UAE. And this has started to strain this very new dialogue between Iran and the Emiratis. So far, I think both sides have made real efforts to downplay the strikes publicly, at least to downplay Iran's potential involvement in them. And the Iranians, from what I understand, have tried to do whatever they could to make it clear that these are Houthi attacks. They're not Iranian attacks. Iran does not have a hand in them. Whether that's true or not, I will leave that up to everybody else to decide. But there is a real effort to isolate these attacks from Iran's engagement of the UAE. And I think that comes again from a kind of sense of pragmatism and realism on both sides. And again, I think it's welcome. It's unclear whether that will last, particularly if the pace of these attacks increase. But nevertheless, for now, it's a very welcome way to deal with them. A quick look at Iran's relations with Qatar, if I may. Qatar has had obviously way less problematic relations with Iran, and Mehran will be able to tell you a lot more to that than I will. But their relations have generally been pretty positive. They've had to engage with one another because of the gas fields. So the Qataris have usually been much more pragmatic when it came to dealing with Iran over the years. More recently, Qatar's mediation credentials have once again been highlighted when it came to Afghanistan and etc. And so there may be a push, and we may be witnessing it on the part of the Qataris to kind of mediate between the Iranians and the Americans, who, remember, while they are supposedly negotiating with one another in Vienna, they're not meeting directly. So it's still useful to have additional mediators between them. And they've generally maintained good ties. In fact, I would argue their ties probably got improved somewhat after the GCC split, because firstly, the Qataris stood firm on their desire to continue engaging with the Iranians at a time where some of its Gulf Arab neighbors were asking it not to. And I think Iran appreciated that. And in return, Iran helped out at a time that was particularly difficult for Qatar. So I think both sides, again, are very pragmatic. They will continue this relationship. There may be ups and downs, but those ups and downs have generally been pretty manageable compared to with other countries. And I suspect that that's just how it's going to continue for the foreseeable future. Very quickly, for the last couple of minutes, I want to talk a little bit about the prospects for a more general regional dialogue amongst the Gulf Arab states and Iran. There is a renewed international push for something like this to happen, probably again as a result of COVID and maximum pressure, and the same reasons that led to a regional pragmatism, I think, has led to an international realization that this kind of dialogue is very much necessary in the region. And so I think the best way forward is for European stakeholders. I think for the US, it's probably still too ambitious, given that they're still very much involved in the JCPOA. But for European stakeholders to help those in the region, and for me, those countries are Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait, who have the potential to play a mediatory role in this dialogue, to help them create the groundwork and even to build on some of it that's been done as a result of the Baghdad conference and the Baghdad process that we've seen in the last year, to bring the parties to the table and kick off an inclusive regional dialogue that would focus on this part of the world. This isn't going to be easy. It's going to be complicated. There's going to be several spoilers, all of which we can address in the Q&A if you want. But I think we are at a moment in time where this kind of dialogue is now much more possible than it was a few years ago. And I think I'll stop on a positive note.
Thank you very much. You summed up a very complicated set of relationships only the way you can, very succinctly and at the same time in a very in-depth manner. And thank you, terrific. I took copious notes. Ibrahim, we turn to you now.
Okay, thank you, Mehran. Thank you, Dina, and thank you, the Arab Center and the Iran Study Units for this important event and for discussion. And since, Mehran, our audience is mixed English and Arabic language speaking audience, so for balance, allow me to speak in Arabic, if that's okay with the translation. So just, for some balance. Right?
We're grateful to you for doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehran. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so I will switch to Arabic and then maybe we can.
إذن سأنتقل
وهنا أريد أن
Here I would like to summarize my intervention in the 10 minutes or so that have been allocated to me on the relations between Iran and the Arab Gulf countries under the title, Will History Repeat Itself? By that, I want to allude specifically to the period after the Iranian nuclear deal with the 5+1 in 2015, because in my opinion, we are going through the same period again, the period which came post the 2015 agreement. If we compare that period with the current phase we're in, we'll notice a few things. First of all, in 2015, the negotiations took place in Oman. Now that it's taking place in Vienna. In 2015, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries had no idea because everything was done in secrecy. Now the negotiations are conducted openly and we all are following it minute by minute. And the Saudi fears in particular and the Gulf countries fears in general about the Iranian nuclear activities and excluding Iranian foreign policy from the negotiations was not there in 2015. The Iranian foreign policy was not present and the negotiations focused exclusively on the nuclear issues. Now we are doing the same thing. The negotiations are still focusing on the Iranian nuclear issue and not taking into account Iran's foreign policies and Iran's relations with its neighbors in the Gulf. But at the same time, we notice that this time around, there are parallel talks to the Vienna talks, and that is the Baghdad process between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which is something different than 2015. Now we have the Vienna talks or negotiations, and we have a parallel discussion on the Iranian behavior in the region taking place in Baghdad. In my opinion, this parallel process is not solving anything. In fact, it's making matters worse, if we can say that. First of all, the equation governing these parallel talks can be described as follows. The Vienna negotiations are allowed to reach a conclusion and an agreement, even if there is no Saudi-Iranian agreement in Baghdad over Iran's relations with the region, but the opposite is not true. In other words, the major powers will not allow Iran and Saudi Arabia to reach an agreement in Baghdad or make their negotiations a success in isolation from the Vienna talks, because the Vienna talks are the ceiling for the Saudi-Iranian negotiations in Baghdad. If we look at the progress level, we will notice that the negotiations in Vienna are almost reaching the end of an agreement or agreeing on agreement, so much so that people think that it's the Vienna reaching an agreement almost, but it's back and forth to get final guarantees or something by way of details. Whereas in comparison, the Baghdad process is different. Not an inch of progress has been achieved. All the talk is focusing on opening a consulate section in Mashhad or Jeddah or something like that. And when we look at the dynamics of the Baghdad negotiations or Baghdad dialogue, we can't fail but notice that Iran has used this process for the purposes of public relations, nothing more. There's been a lot of Iranian statements about progress which has been achieved, this and that. Yet at the same time, there's always been almost a constant wave of Saudi denials that such progress has been achieved, because the Baghdad process, after all, was supposedly to deal with issues that the 2015 agreement or negotiations did not pertain to. And we noticed that all the statements about the Baghdad process came from Iraqi ministers close to the Iranian government. And therefore, in conclusion, we can say that the Baghdad process was nothing more than an attempt to allay the fears and quiet down the concerns about Iran's regional relations. And maybe we need another round of discussions to discuss the possibility or the probability that if the Iranian process or the Vienna process was to be a success, what do we need to discuss after that by way of other issues? I think we will have a lot to discuss. In 2015, when it was agreed that if there is an agreement on the nuclear, Iranian nuclear activities, will there be afterwards a change in the Iranian policies in the region? The answer is no, because nothing has changed. In fact, the current situation so that it is much worse than that. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in 2022 and there's been many changes. There are the Houthi, maybe Iranian for that matter, ballistic missiles, we don't know. These ballistic missiles have reached Aramco and Abu Dhabi and the entire region. This was not the case in 2015. So therefore, the security situation now is much more difficult than how it was in 2015. And if there was any incentive for Iran to change its behavior after the nuclear deal, now that the Houthi missiles are reaching the strategic depth of the UAE or Saudi Arabia, Iran has no longer an incentive to change its foreign policy in this direction. So therefore, there are no good omens concerning any change in the Iranian position, according to the immediate analysis. The question is, what has Saudi Arabia done? They know all these changes from 2015 until now. And now that we started by saying that history may repeat itself, but according to what we are witnessing now, history may be repeating itself, but in a much worse manner than 2015. Saudi Arabia not only didn't do anything, but they got involved in the war in Yemen, and they got involved deeper and deeper in that quagmire, and also have not managed to reach any sort of understanding with Iran. We noticed that 2016, 18, 20, etc., Iran was reeling and still is under the heavy burden of sanctions, which is probably the most stringent form of sanctions since 1979. So no restoration of the regional balance has been achieved, and also no lessons were heeded from 2015, and that's Saudi Arabia, because the major powers may still strike a deal with Iran and still exclude Saudi Arabia from it. There is another dimension to the lack of stability in the region, and that is, instead of reaching regional understanding, outside players or factors like Israel have been invited into the region. This kind of Israeli involvement will make the situation more complex, worse, and the security situation will be worse for many reasons. First of all, any Israeli presence in the region, and we've been following in the news that there are Israeli security officers or officer in working with the Bahrain naval forces. The Israeli presence in the region, first of all, undermines the element of trust in the region, and there are many research conclusions testifying to that this may lead into exacerbating the security situation in the region between the different parties in the region. And secondly, if the question, so far as Iran is concerned in the past, that they can go to Syria to fight under the guise of fighting Sunni extremism or terrorism, or now the Israeli threat is next door on the Iranian border, and it's on Iran's border. So if this situation is turned now into a regional conflict, it's known that in international conflicts that any power involved in a struggle or conflict can go to the end of the world just to fight what they perceive as a threat, a security threat to them. So therefore, the Israeli activity in this sense is at the heart of Iran's national security concerns. And if there is any understanding to be between the Gulf countries and Iran, the Israeli presence will undermine that, and it will not achieve the kind of balance the Gulf countries are seeking with Iran, because at the end of the day, Israel will not fight on behalf of anybody. And even with their strong objection to the 2015 agreement, they could not stop the Obama administration, although the US is the strongest ally of Israel. Israel could not stop the administration from going ahead with the deal. So therefore, so far as undermining security, undermining the trust between the two sides, all of this will not encourage Iran at all to make any changes in its foreign policy. Mehran, if you give me 1 minute, please.
1 minute, 1 minute.
دقيقة واحدة. Okay. Also, if there is at the economic level, there is an Emirati activity, and like Dina has said, when Sheikh Tahboub's visit, Tahnoun's visit to Tehran, and this kind of rapprochement between Iran, Turkey, and the UAE, in my opinion, any economic activity is not more than a confidence building measure, and it will not impact the political and the security decisions, and its effect will remain limited. Therefore, in my opinion, we need to keep a close eye on the situation, because there are alarming signs. Maybe we need another seminar with Mehran and the other colleagues in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Absolutely, you're absolutely right that we might need another seminar. As you mentioned, the JCPOA is about to be signed soon, and this relationship is far too complicated. I'm particularly grateful to you for highlighting the complicating role of Israel. I am sure that policymakers, both in Gulf capitals as well as in Tehran, are aware and trying to figure out how to calibrate their policies accordingly. Let's look at Iran's relations with Oman and turn to Houchang Hassan-Yari. Houchang, the floor is yours. Houchang, your mic is muted. If you would unmute.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was thanking Mehran and the Center for the invitation. It's great to be here with other colleagues as well. If you give me the permission, I will get out of somehow the bilateral relations between Iran and Oman, talking about the region, the Persian Gulf region countries in general.
That'd be great if you do it in 10 minutes.
In 10 minutes. Stop me whenever I reach the point. When we talk about the region, we have to take into consideration, I believe, 3 elements. The first one is that the size of Iran, geographically, militarily, economically, although the economy is not in a good shape, make it very difficult really to the smaller countries in the region, and this imbalance will have effects. The second point is the weakness of the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf make it, like it or not, very difficult to have normal relations with Iran. And finally, the elements or the factor of external actors as a player in the region. As we can see, the geopolitics of the region is changing. Iran spent billions of dollars to become neighbor to Israel through Hezbollah, through Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and so forth. Israel did not spend apparently any money to become neighbor to Iran, thanks to the Iranian regional policy. It goes back to the idea of imbalance and so forth. In this context, it would be, from my perspective, it would be extremely difficult to imagine a day where the relationship between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Persian Gulf countries, Arab Persian Gulf countries, to become normal. Is not going to happen for a very practical reason. The first one is, I believe, Iran, despite the fact that my colleagues mentioned the pragmatism and the realism sometimes prevailing in Tehran, Iran is foreign policy of Iran, regional policy of Iran is mostly ideological and ideology driven. In that sense, the whole question of Baghdad track and so forth, I believe is not going to produce any tangible result, even if momentarily Iranians and Saudis talk to each other and try to somehow overcome their differences. The reason for that, from my perspective, is that both Saudis and Iranians, they look at themselves as the leaders of the Islamic world. So for the Saudis, for very practical, very obvious reasons, the holy sites of Islam are there, and consequently, they hold the keys. For the Iranians, the Iranian leader is Amir al-Mu'minin. So it's the leader is the leader of all Muslims. And there is no compromise here, because you cannot divide the responsibility between the two, or you give them the opportunity to jointly play that role. So in that sense, I believe that this hostility between those two bigger countries in the region will make it extremely difficult for smaller countries to normalize. The case of Oman, as Dr. Kamrava mentioned, could be an exception, in a sense that foreign policy of Oman is very different from that of Iran, that of Saudi Arabia and other members of the GCC. And consequently, for the Omanis, they maintain, let's say, a decent relationship with Iran, although in a crucial moments, if we take GCC decisions as that moment, they go with the group. So all those resolutions passed by GCC in regards to the 3 islands in the Persian Gulf, Oman votes in favor of Emirati's position and so forth. So if I concentrate a bit on the Iranian element in facilitating the Israeli introduction into the region, as we know, since the Obama administration, they announced their partial retreat from the region. That created a lot of anxiety in the GCC countries, and since then we could see a lot of activities, more than before, activities going on in order to somehow reach a kind of rapprochement between the two sides, and finally all of that happened with the Abraham Accord. I would say thanks to the Iranians that that happened. I'm absolutely sure if Iranians didn't pursue that policy in the famously put 4 Arab countries controlling 4 Arab capitals, that would not happen so easily and so fast. So I would say that the fear of Islamic republics, especially my colleagues mentioned the case of attack on Aramco, and more recently Abu Dhabi, and so many other questions of that nature, made it absolutely easy for the Israelis to become somehow replacement for the American umbrella. So this is why we see this euphoria, the very fast activities. Dr. Ibrahim mentioned Bahrain, Iron Dome, probably in the UAE, and I'm absolutely sure that at some point the Saudis also will join. They don't do that at this moment for very practical reasons, but we know that the level of relationship between the two sides. So when we look at the Iranian behavior in the region, we cannot help it but look at the dynamic inside of Iran. Mehran and myself, when we were preparing that paper on the structure of power in Iran, we could see that the existence of multiple centers of pressure, of decision-making, and all of that make it absolutely difficult for anybody, even with the best intentions in Iran, to become a normal country in the region. They will not reach that point as far as I am concerned, and I understand it, unless they find themselves completely cornered, and at that point, yes, they become pragmatic. Two examples: the acceptance of Resolution 598 by the Islamic Republic that suspended the military activities with Iraq in the past, and then the narmesh, or this flexibility, heroic flexibility that the leader did, giving opportunity to reach JCPOA more recently. So if the Iranians come to the conclusion that they can push, they will do it as far as possible unless they hit the wall. If they hit the wall, they will back down. At this point, the wall is extremely weak. The Obama administration, now Biden administration, and we will see that the Iranians become more and more aggressive if the agreement will give them the opportunity of access to billions of dollars. And also, this is one element. The other one is now there is a kind of confidence growing in Tehran that the support of Russia and China, especially now in the context of Ukraine and the Chinese and Russians, they are coming to some kind of understanding about the NATO, the threat of NATO, and so forth. So Iranians count on that as well. And unless there is a real pressure this time from Russians and Chinese, we will see the behavior of the Islamic Republic will continue as it has been in the past few years. And if a second or JCPOA2 is reached, we will see even more intervention by Iran in the region. I stop it here for the sake of to avoid Mehran's not to be disciplined by Mehran.
Well, you're very kind. Mehran would never dare. Thank you. My sincere thanks to you, Houchang, and to all three of you for three very perceptive and very different analyses. It was very good to get three very different perspectives. One of the questions I have for the whole panel is, I was curious that none of you mentioned, and at least I didn't pick up, a change in administration in Tehran. And it appears that there's been, Dina, you alluded to this kind of flurry of diplomacy that Iran has been engaging in. And I wonder if the foreign minister, the current foreign minister, the fact that he's an Arabist, or at least he presents himself as an Arabist or thinks of himself as an Arabist, I wonder if that has anything to do with it. The fact that Ibrahim mentioned they're trying to engage in foreign policy. You mentioned, Dina, that they've been going to different capitals. And it seems like there is a flurry of diplomacy, particularly with Raisi. It also appears as if the Saudis now think that the division within the Iranian political system between the office of the supreme leader and the presidency no longer is valid, and that they can't blame former Foreign Minister Zarif or former President Rouhani, and that President Raisi now is on the same page as Khamenei. So I wonder if any of you would comment on the importance of the change of administration in Tehran or lack thereof. Houchang, I think you had your, you wanted to make a comment?
Yes, thank you, Mehran. This is a very good question. Very quick answer and a clear answer. There is no change in the leadership in Tehran. What we see is really different faces of the same reality. When Khatami was president, everybody said, oh, Iran is going to engage and so forth. He could not do it. Then Ahmadinejad, then Rouhani, now Raisi. The reason for that is the decision maker is not in the hand of the president, as you know very well. The president is like a kind of he is executing whatever the leader and his bait they decide. Revolutionary Guards, his close advisor of the leader and so forth. So I don't really expect any kind of change. This change is extremely cosmetic. It's not substantial. And the reason for that we will see. This is why I mentioned earlier the pragmatism takes over when there is a deadline, when the leader doesn't have any other choice. Khomeini was forced to do it. Khamenei is forced to do it. But when the time is better from their perspective, they will go back to the same old regime, decision making. The leader is the one, everybody recognizes that, especially in the case of Raisi, many in Iran, including Fars agency, even Tasnim agencies, the very conservative, they doubt really the ability of Raisi to be an effective president. Amir Abdullahian, his foreign minister, even less. Yes, he's Arabic, but he doesn't speak Arabic, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Dina?
Thanks. So I largely agree, but I would kind of caveat or nuance what Houchang has just said. I agree that, you know, the main decision maker, it goes without saying, of course, it's the supreme leader. The different presidents, though, they do change the tone of Iranian foreign policy. And sometimes I think tone matters for the people that are facing Iran. It's, you know, it can be either more frustrating or less frustrating. So for example, if you talk to the negotiators in the P5+1, they'll tell you they want to tear their hair out right now because engaging with this team is a lot more difficult than engaging with the Zarif team. If you speak to Iran's Gulf Arab neighbors, they'll tell you, well, we don't like these guys, but at least we know that they stand with the supreme leader, so it makes more sense for us to engage with them. And I think that's where the tone matters. I think from the Iranian side, though, when you're talking about this slew of diplomatic activity that we've been seeing, I think that's actually more related to their desire to present themselves as a legitimate, not international power, but a legitimate interlocutor, because there was a lot of criticism thrown their way. Raisi is obviously a very controversial figure. And so this drive towards engagement, conversation, proving that they can play the diplomatic game, I think it's really intended to show that, you know, we may not be the Rouhani administration, but we have just as much experience as them, and we know just as much what we're doing. Again, up to you to decide whether that's true or not.
Thank you, Dina. Ibrahim?
Thank you, Mehran. And I would like to shed light. I agree totally with my friends and my colleagues. But I would like to shed light actually on how this is viewed also from the region, like the change in the administration. Is a really excellent question, Mehran. And here from the region, I mean from the Gulf and the Arab region. And here actually something that comes to my mind right away is that we miss the opinion pieces of Jawad Zarif in the New York Times. His articles in the New York Times, we no longer see them. I recall how Jawad Zarif and Hassan Rouhani used to run these opinion pieces in the New York Times, thinking that this would be a good outreach to the region. But of course, this was never taken seriously. So now this is something that's changing. We don't see that anymore, right, of this. And here, one of the major issues about the change in administration and how it's viewed in the region, it's about, which is something I raise in my book and I talk about it, is about the mixed messages that this region is always hearing from the other side, from Iran, right? It's becoming even hard to differentiate between what is moderate, what is a liberal administration or a president in Tehran, or what is a hardliner. I recall that the relationships with Iran during the times of Ahmadinejad, right, hardliner, were better than during the times of Hassan Rouhani, moderate liberal president in Tehran. So now, you know, another supposedly conservative president coming to Tehran. How is this viewed in the region? Again, this issue of mixed messages, not understanding what to expect and where the message is coming from, and the impact of Jawad Zarif opinion pieces, articles in the New York Times. That's all mixed up and makes it so difficult for the region here is to understand and make sense of this change of administration, which exacerbates the problem, not unfortunately helping in resolving it or making it lighter.
Thank you, Ibrahim. On that point, I would be curious. Recently, we celebrated, or we came across, rather than celebrate, the 50th year in which Nixon opened up relations with China, between the United States and China. And one argument is that only someone with Nixon's conservative credentials could do that. And could open relations with China. Does the same logic hold that only someone with Raisi or Amir Abdullahian's conservative credentials could improve relations between Iran and the Arab neighbors, which Zarif and others who were known in Tehran as the American boys couldn't do?
Well, thank you, Mehran. This is really great point. And we're in total agreement, actually. Many of the tough peace agreements actually were made by the hardliners, right? Not the moderates. And when I refer, of course, it was only Richard Nixon who could do this, right? A strong US administration. And also when I come back to the case of Iran and the Gulf, Ahmadinejad made several visits during his times, you know, to Riyadh, and met with King Abdullah, and during the OIC meetings and all of that. So things were to a certain extent contained. Actually, they deteriorated during the times of became much worse during the times of Hassan Rouhani. And also when I recall the Israel-Egypt peace treaty, it was the Likud who made it, not the Labor, right, who made it. So it was Menachem Begin, right, who made it, not Isaac Rabin, who made the Oslo Agreement, but never launched or never made any serious progress. Of course, I believe the new administration in Tehran, the new president, Ibrahim Raisi, or the one who can do it, because, you know, he presents the hardliner side and can make these courageous decisions, which is something that always the region wanted to see, is linking these statements and the Arabist statements by the current foreign minister, linking it to action, right? Because this has been constantly the demand. We need to see action from Tehran, not talks. Unfortunately, Jawad Zarif articles were only talks, but the current administration, the current president can take action, and he has an opportunity to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. Houchang?
No. Meaning that, I'm sorry, to your question, no. For the simple reason that Nixon was the president. In Iran, you have a president and then you have a leader. Leader is the one who makes decision, as we discussed earlier. The president is going to execute, but I'm quite sure that the leader is not going to make such a decision for very practical reasons. If we go back to when Khomeini accepted the resolution 598, we saw many of the commanders of the Revolutionary Guards, very pure from the perspective of Islamic Republic, very pure revolutionaries. They were disgusted by the decision of Khomeini, who was really very charismatic, and from their perspective, their imam, the real one. So if Khomeini was in that situation, imagine that Khamenei, who doesn't have that charisma and who is contested for his religious credential, for his foreign policy, and a lot of corruption going on, and the Iranian protesters shouting his name and attacking his name and his office, what kind of legitimacy he is going to have to make such a decision? It's not going to happen, and we will see. I hope you are much younger than me. I hope the life will serve us to see the moment that both of us will be disappointed once again by the leadership of the Islamic Republic. That is not going to happen.
Thank you. We're running a little over time, but this is a fascinating discussion. Dina, I want to ask for your permission to paraphrase you to ask Houchang a question. Houchang, one of the arguments that Dina made in a very compelling way is that when Iran is pushed, then it lashes out. And we saw that in terms of the attack on Abqaiq, and we saw that in terms of its behavior in places like Iraq and Syria. And when there's constructive engagement, then we see a moderation in Iran's behavior. Dina, I hope I did justice to your very deep and much more in-depth analysis. But you seem to be arguing, Houchang, the opposite, which is Iran behaves, to quote you, normally when it is put under pressure. How would you respond to the issue of Iran, of constructive engagement or conditional engagement with Iran, as opposed to when you put pressure, it's as if you, when you corner a cat, then they lash out, and then when you attract more with honey rather than with vinegar.
Sorry, thank you very much, Mehran, and thanks very much to Dina. That's a great, really point. I believe that I came to the conclusion after a few decades of watching the Iranian evolution that the most important, and this one doesn't come from me, it comes from Khomeini and Khamenei themselves. When the survival of the regime is in jeopardy, they will back down. The two examples I mentioned are clear illustration of that reality. As for the constructive engagement, it depends from whose perspective is constructive or not. From the Tehran's perspective, constructive is when the rest of the world, or at least let's say the region and the West, recognize their domination over the situation in the region. There is no doubt about that. What they are looking for is not really to behave normally like any other country. As Dr. Ibrahim mentioned, Ahmadinejad paid a number of trips to Arab countries. What was the result of that? Nothing, because again, I go back to the point of these are very cosmetic, very show-off trips in order to show that we want to do that. But the real question is not Ahmadinejad or now the Raisi's trip to Doha, is what the Revolutionary Guard are doing on the ground. Look at those 4 countries, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And also, it's very interesting that the Revolutionary Guards, when they are doing those maneuvers, testing their missiles, they say this is to show our neighbors that we are able to provide security for them. And look at the region, how they look at those missiles as a threat. So it means that from the perspective of the Iranians, it doesn't matter really what the other countries in the region they understand from their behavior. This is why we didn't see, and we will not see, any real attempt, including in the case of Iraq. The Iraqis are protesting against the Iranians, the Iranian regime, despite the fact that the Islamic Republic is ruining the country in favor of those countries.
Okay, thank you. Dina has been patiently sitting, and I'm most grateful to you, Dina, for your patience. We come to you.
To be honest, I don't know. I don't know how much I agree or disagree, actually, with my co-panelist Houchang. I think you are able to moderate Iranian behavior. I think that the problem is when you look at it from outside, you look at an Iran that is, from its perspective, trying to secure itself, trying to secure its borders, trying to increase its influence beyond its borders. Those, for me, are all the hallmarks of what a normal state would do. Every other country in the world wants to secure itself, secure its borders, and increase its influence outside its borders. So firstly, I disagree with the premise that Iran does not act like a normal country. I think it does. I think it's just from our perspective, sitting on the outside, it frustrates us that Iran does these things because it's making regional security worse by doing them. But from Tehran's perspective, it's only doing it to make sure that it is safe from external threat. It is safe from American encirclement in the region. It is safe from the growing weapons arsenals of its neighboring Gulf Arab states. So again, what we think it's doing and what it thinks it's doing are two very different things. In terms of being able to moderate it, again, I think the only thing that works with a country that acts in this manner is in fact the two-pronged approach that the Emiratis have only just started adopting now. You cannot engage Iran without trying to contain it, and you cannot contain it without trying to engage it. It's as simple as that, one without the other. You can't just use carrots and you can't just use sticks. People have tried just sticks with Iran and it hasn't led anywhere. Trump tried just sticks with Iran and look at where we are today. It's got an expanding weapons program, nuclear program, let's be clear. It's got an expanding nuclear program that now we're having to renegotiate to contain. It lashed out in the region so significantly that it frightened its neighbors. And it gained various footholds in the region. Now it goes without saying that, of course, its influence has suffered a blow in countries like Iraq and Lebanon. I mean, those are obvious. But again, from Tehran's perspective, oh, they don't like us. That's just a blip in the road. They don't really care as much. That doesn't really affect it in the long run, because in the long run, Iran has very deep ties, people-to-people ties with these countries. So it thinks it can weather the storm. So ultimately, I maintain that I think the best way to give us influence over Iran's actions is through a combination of carrots and sticks, and by trying to negotiate long-term concessions as you're trying to contain it in the short term.
Thank you very much. We're running over time, but we have 3 questions. So I'm going to ask them very briefly, and if any of you would care to take them, I'd really appreciate it. But if you would, please just keep your answers to 1 minute. You guys have been so wonderful, and thanks to Ibrahim, I want to have all 3 of you back for further discussions in the future. So I don't want to abuse your goodwill and impose on your time. So first question is about Saudi Arabia. How can Saudi Arabia be useful to Iran? Doesn't Iran need Africa and Europe more than it needs Saudi Arabia? That's one question. A second question has to do with Iraq. Is Iran willing to change its behavior in Iraq and withdraw from it? And finally, what trust factors can exist between the Gulf countries and Israel that do not exist between the Gulf countries and Iran? In other words, what do the Gulf states see in Israel that they don't see in Iran? Or why do they trust Israel and why don't they trust Iran? So those are three questions. I throw them out there if any of you would take any of the questions.
I'm happy to take a first stab.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take them in the other direction in terms of Israel, and I'm sure my co-panelists will be able to add to it. But I really think it's a case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There was a lot of mistrust between Israel and the Gulf Arab states. It goes without saying, much like there is between Iran and the Gulf Arab states. But they have a common enemy at the moment, which allows them to come together publicly in order to address some of the very common threats that they have in the region. And when I say a common enemy, I don't mean literally an enemy like Iran, for example. I also just mean the perception, the security perceptions that they have, like, for example, the US withdrawal from the region. That's kind of a common enemy. It's something that everybody has to tackle in the region. And so I think it makes sense for them to address them together. You don't have that as much between Iran and the Gulf Arab states. At the moment, you have more points of difference between them than points of convergence, even though, as I mentioned earlier, I do think that, like, the public health crisis showed that they had to work together, that maximum pressure showed that just pressure doesn't work, but that doesn't really bring them together long term. As of yet, it helps them de-escalate, but it doesn't help them build ties. That's my quick answer to that. In Iraq, I don't have an answer that's going to make anybody happy. I don't think Iran has any intention whatsoever of ever disengaging from Iraq. Why? Because there's 910 miles of very porous border between the two countries. Because last time Iraq was at odds with Iran, it led to an 8-year war that was devastating for Iran. And because Iran has very real interests and a very real sizable contingency in Iraq, that is of significant importance to it. So for me, if you're going to do a hierarchy of countries and their order of importance for Iran, Iraq is number one. So I don't think you're ever going to see Iranian disengagement from it. In terms of how Iran views Saudi versus other countries, again, I think Iran looks at these things in a very pragmatic kind of manner. And also it sees itself perhaps more generously than we would see it. I think it attributes more importance to itself than we would attribute to it. And so from Iran's perspective, their number one goal is always going to be the legitimacy of engaging with great powers, Russia, China, the European states, the US, even though that's a controversial country for it to engage with. So they're always going to be more important. Iran does not view the Gulf Arab states in the same manner as it views these countries. So that perception of one another is already skewed, because for Iran, it's a much smaller concern than Iran is for the Gulf Arab states. And that has always been a problem in their relations. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dina. Ibrahim?
Thank you, Mehran, and I agree with Dina. Let me start with the issue of Israel and why they trust Israel more than they trust Iran. And here my answer is how they see it, not the way how I see it, right? So because the question is about why they do this, is about why they trust it. They see it this way. The Gulf states, they see it this way, is that Israel's expansionist agenda is in Palestine, not in the Gulf, right? Israel wants Jerusalem, not Dubai or Abu Dhabi. Israel wants to build settlements in the West Bank, right? They want to take over the whole Palestine, right? So that's where they see the Israeli agenda is. They don't see it is in Dubai or in Manama or in Riyadh, right? So on that note, they would engage with Israel and build what they think as collaboration, or what they see it as collaboration. regarding, against Iran. And as Dina said, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, here again is a very important point that Houchang mentioned again, previously in this discussion, which is Iran should have been aware of this as well, because also the Iranians' behavior over the past years contributed to this kind of understanding, or this development of understanding, is that they would go ally with Israel because of the Iranians' foreign policy behavior in the region, because they see the Iranian agenda is coming after the Gulf, right? Unlike Israel, that's going after Jerusalem and the West Bank, right? So Iran never gave the Gulf states the assurances or the indicators to trust that Iran can be a peaceful neighbor, or a neighbor that does not have expansionist agenda in the Gulf. So Iran, in fact, in this area, is reproducing its security dilemma because of this behavior. Also, that they went and allied with Israel, and Israel came and became on their borders as well, on the Iranian borders, and became a national security issue. So the security issue for Iran is also exacerbated. And here is the Iranian role, again, as Houchang said earlier, is contributing to reproducing its own security fears or security concerns. I don't think Iran will ever be leaving Iraq, agreeing with Dina, but slightly disagreeing, actually, that slightly, Dina, not much. I think this influence, Iranian influence in Baghdad, will be changing, and it has changed actually since 2003, the fall of Saddam. We are seeing some Iraqi resentment against this Iranian domination of of power and decisions in Iraq. We saw protests in Basra. We saw burning consulates of Iran in Najaf, in the holy city, right, in Iraq. So slowly, and this, when we have this clash between what's a national agenda and what's the neighbor's agenda, when we see this clash is happening, Iraqis, or some parts of the Iraqis, will be choosing their own national agenda. And that's how we saw this influence is decreasing, and Shia who led protests against the Iranian influence and attacking the Iranian embassy. So it's changing. But again, I don't think we will see it disengaging, because there is the support to Iran, or the alliance with Iran is structural, meaning that it's among established political parties with certain ideologies, right? That they're not going to abandon it or change it. So the last thing, and very briefly, Mehran, is why Iran needs Saudi Arabia, or does it need Saudi Arabia? I mean, the two countries are making the biggest mistake ever by engaging in this kind of rivalry. I think the two countries need each other. If Iran thinks that it can become part of the region, a legitimate need and a legitimate objective through armed militias, through illegitimate means, I think Iran is very mistaken. If Saudi Arabia thinks that can counter Iran with an Israeli presence in the Gulf, it's fully mistaken. That's not the way the approach to go. Both countries need to adjust and adapt to their conflict strategies to the best interest of them. And actually, that's how I explain about this all of how to do it and how to reform conflict strategies for both. That I dedicated the whole book for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I was actually going to suggest to our audience that for very concrete steps on improving relations, they should read your book, but you did that already. Houchang, you get the last word, but I would beg of you to be brief if possible. Go ahead, please. You're on mute, Houchang.
The Iranians say, نوبت به انبیا چو رسید آسمان تپید زان ضربتی که بر سر شیر خدا زد. No, now that is my turn, I have to. Okay, first with Iraqis. Iran needs Iraq not necessarily for the sake of Iraq itself, but because Iraq gives access to Syria, Syria gives access to Lebanon. So if the bridge is broken, then that would be extremely difficult for the Islamic Republic to continue maintaining its presence and hopefully from their perspective dominations in the region. There is also some religious element, holy sites and the billions of dollars that the Iranians spend to decorate the shrines and the mausoleums. As for the Saudi Arabia, I believe that from the perspective of Tehran, if they see Saudi Arabia as the master of the GCC, and if they can control the master, they can control the others. The main problem, I believe, from the perspective of Tehran that the Saudis have is the question of legitimacy I mentioned earlier. Khomeini said it, and it was repeated by Khamenei even more recently, that the Saudi leadership is illegitimate. They are, again, from the perspective of Islamic Republic, they are puppets of the American imperialism, and consequently, they should be dismissed from controlling of the holy sites. This is why the Iranians propose a kind of Islamization or internationalization of the holy sites, not to be under the control of the Saudis. And finally, to be brief, when it comes to the question of Israel, I believe that for the Israel doesn't have really present the threat that the Iranians are doing, even in the worst period of time, 67, 73, 82, and so forth. So as Ibrahim mentioned rightly, for the Israelis, expansion is somewhere else. And here is the question of containing Iran. So by being present in the region, Israelis do two things. The first one is to expanding its territory to the Persian Gulf and became neighbor to Iran. The second one is to obviously for very practical reasons. There are security issues here, and consequently there is a need for the Israeli expertise, military technology, and so forth. So there is a market, but also there is a kind of affinities, understanding of the same threat. So for Israel, the Iranian Islamic Republic threat is existential, and consequently they have to do whatever it takes in order to neutralize that threat. So being neighbor is easier for them to do. I stop it here.
My sincere thanks to all three of you. Thank you, Houchang, and all three of you. I asked for an hour of your time, and I took an hour and a half. And for that, I apologize, but I'm also very grateful to all three of you for your kind analysis. Dina Esfandiary, Ibrahim Fraihat, and Houchang Hassan-Yari. And my sincere thanks also to our audiences around the world. Thank you all, and we hope to have all three of you back here again in the near future. Good day from Doha. Thank you.
Thank you.
After the Vienna talks.
Definitely.
Thank you, Mehran.
Thank you.
Very nice to you.